Hey art nerds, today I'm going to walk you through this alcohol marker mixed media piece that I created to sell at the Nashville Cherry Blossom Festival. So these are the materials that I begin with. I have a thumbnail sketch, I have a pink Color Eno pencil for undersketching, and I have several markers selected to give me an idea of the palette I'm aiming for. So I begin by doing a sketch in pink lead. This is generally how I begin most of my lineless alcohol marker and lineless watercolor pieces. And I sort of wanted to draw her in a ballet inspired pose since she's a delicate cherry blossom girl. And I have lots of tutorials on this channel for doing chibi drawing, for doing figure drawing, and I highly recommend you guys check out. I begin by doing a constructed anatomy form, and this is just to give me an idea of where everything's going to go. Whenever I draw any sort of characters, be they cartoony or chibi or more realistic, I always begin with this sort of wireframe form, and I apologize for the grousey cat in the background. He wants attention. I also begin by breaking down her face into a constructed face, I guess, face template, face base. And when I do cartoony figures, I draw the eyes much larger and the nose small and round and fairly simple. I also tend to go with what I think is cute, which is typically large hands, large feet, big eyes, big mouth, and large ears. As I go, I refine the pose, and I use cylinders to help me block out the arms and legs, and triangles or wedges to help me block out the pose of the feet. I keep the hands very simple as well, focusing more on the gesture. You can almost think of these as like balloony style hands because I tend to stay away from adding joints to the fingers and just use curves to help indicate finger position. Once my figure has been sketched in, I begin sketching in her clothes, and I wanted to go for a cherry blossom tutu, something really simple, light, and springish. This was done in my Blick Studio sketchbook. I really like the paper in this sketchbook, and if you guys remember my Monster Girl marker illustrations from last year, this is the same paper that I used then. I'm going to go ahead and use an eraser to clean up a lot of the construction lines. You don't have to, but I find that alcohol marker tends to turn the pink Color Eno lead into a fluorescent neon pink, which is nice in some areas, but I don't necessarily want a fluorescent stripe in the middle of her face. So I erase any lines after I no longer need them. Next, I begin sketching in her hair. As you guys can see from the thumbnail sketch, I wanted her to have short hair reminiscent of a cherry blossom blowing in the wind. So I begin by sketching in the major forms. When I sketch hair, I usually begin with the bangs since they cover the face and then work my way out. I also decided to give her high little pigtails up on the side, sort of like Sakura Kinomoto from Cardcaptor Sakura. I just think that hairstyle is really cute, and I thought it would give it a fun spring-like appearance. Drawing her in a ballet tutu had a tendency to make this go a little bit too formal and feel like I was trying for elegant rather than cute, but adding these little pigtails in helps it stay kind of casual. I also sketched sort of like lacy wrist guards just to help push that cherry blossom fluttering sort of feeling. Right now, I'm just kind of cleaning up my drawing, tightening up my lines. This is really important for me. My eyesight is really poor, so I can't just go with light, sketchy lines. I have to go with something that I can actually see. Also sketching in cherry blossoms at her ankle. I wanted to have the cherry blossom theme kind of consistent throughout. I don't mind if it looks kind of costumey. It is, after all, a costume. I also drew little knee socks. At the time, I was kind of thinking more of like a cherry blossom magical girl than, say, a cherry blossom ballerina. And I used the green colored lead just to kind of sketch in where the leaves are going to be. This is more of a reminder for myself. And I used a leaf ponytail holder, which is going to help kind of imply that these are cherry blossoms. Now that everything's sketched in, I begin working with alcohol markers, and I use Blick Studio Brush markers and Copic markers interchangeably, although they do utilize different solvents. When I'm coloring in the eyes, I like to add in a shadow layer of blue. What I really like about using alcohol markers on this Blick Studio sketchbook paper is it is a very absorbent paper, but everything bleeds through, so you get a lot of blending and you can get a lot of color play. It's not necessarily the best paper if you want to do a lot of layers or if you want to do something that's very rendered, but it can be really fun for the overblending technique that I'm using here in the Cherry Blossom Girl and that I use with the Monster Girls. And overblending is just when you really saturate the paper and the paper is still wet. It takes a while for the alcohol to evaporate out, and then you immediately go in with the next color so it dissolves very softly, or you use a lighter color to sort of blend and push back your initial color, or you use the colorless blender for the same thing. And I find that that technique works really well with the lineless style. And it also means you can use fewer markers because your markers stay open, they stay workable a little bit longer, so you can do more color blending and more color shifting. You don't need as large a marker collection. So with her face, I basically try to color in the shadows or where darker areas are going to be, leaving where the sun or the light would hit her face, and then I blend that back to soften the transition with a blender marker. And that's what I mean by over blending. You're going to utilize the white of the paper much the same as you would if you were doing a watercolor painting. It's one of the things I really like about this technique is it's softer, it's a little bit more reminiscent of watercolor, but you still get the really vibrant alcohol marker colors. And you guys can see that my Color Eno, the pink lead, is still visible even though I'm adding marker on top of it. Now I'm using a darker color. I think I started with E000 or E00 and now I'm using E51. So I'm using sort of warmer Caucasian skin tones just because those are kind of more reminiscent of like the light pinks you would get with cherry blossoms. And then I use Blick's Shell as the start of my blush color. And I like applying blush across the cheeks, the bridge of the nose, the tops of the eyes, the lips, the bottom of the nose, underneath the neck, the interior of the ears, on the fingertips, the palms, the elbows, and basically anywhere skin kind of creases over skin. It gives it kind of a nice, lively appearance. And I apologize that my head keeps entering the shot. As I told you guys before, my eyesight is terrible. So now I'm using like E29, I believe, just to add some of the darker shadows to her skin. The overblending technique can be really fun because you can add really dark shadows and it'll blend out nicely. Not that the E29 is a really dark shadow, but you know. So for her stockings, I want them to be like sheer white or sheer pink stockings so you can see a bit of the skin tone underneath. So I go ahead and I apply one of my warmer pinks on top of it just to get the colors blending. I also start with her hair. Now I am starting with the lightest color, which is like R either quadruple zero or R triple zero, a very, very light pink, almost white. I like using this as a blending and a starting color when I'm working with reds and pinks because it adds a little bit more color than, say, the colorless blender. You're not trying to push back to no color at all. You're just pushing back to a very light pink. The only real problem with using your sketchbooks for alcohol marker pieces is that the paper will drain your markers really fast, so you're going to have to refill them. And I try to leave a lot of highlights in the hair. I just feel like this is cuter. Of course, it's a little bit more reminiscent of anime, but it also makes the hair look shiny and vibrant and attractive. And you don't have to use as many layers in the hair as I'm using in this technique. If you guys go back and watch my Monster Girl videos, which use the same techniques, I don't always use the same number of layers, or sometimes I will blend in colors from other color families to give it kind of an iridescent look. I'm using the same very, very light red to color in her cuffs and her dress. And since she's cherry blossom themed, that's kind of where I'm going, is I'm aiming for very light pinks that tinge red, that tinge pink. And I'm coloring in her socks with the same very light color. I want the tops of her stockings to be darker than the socks, but I do want them to appear as stockings. I don't want it to seem like she's bare-legged, because that is a very short dress, and the Cherry Blossom Festival is a family event. I'm adding another layer of pink to her hair. This one's much darker. Now that the first layers have dried, by waiting for the marker to dry, you get a sharper transition. So with the overblending technique, you're going to be working wet into wet like you would with watercolor, and then you can add sharper details, more line delineation, which will help imply more of, say, a reflection. By allowing the ink to dry and then doing your next layer. Now I'm trying to keep lots of my prior layers still visible so that we build up enough contrast and everything doesn't get this kind of like soft Gaussian blur effect. That works for some artists, but I don't care for it for my style. Now I'm using a much darker pink. I think it's Poppy Red from Blick on her ballet shoes. I'm going to blend that out in a little bit. I'm trying to achieve the look of like satin shoes, so we're going to have darker colors that softly blend out. And I'm just using that Poppy Red again to add jewels and the straps on her tutu. I'm also using it to start delineating the darkest colors in her hair. Now, if you have a steadier hand than I do, you're not going to need to ink this style at all. You can use your alcohol markers like I'm doing to draw in her eyelashes to do all of your details. My hands shake just a little bit too much, and I like my art to be a little bit tighter. So later on, I'm going to go ahead and ink this. But you don't have to. That's one of the fun things about this kind of lineless style, is it's really up to you. Another nice thing is that the color Eno leads do kind of dissolve when you add alcohol on them, and they don't smear the way graphite smears. Graphite can ruin your alcohol marker nibs, which is why you guys don't see me do alcohol marker over graphite. You see me do alcohol marker over colored leads. Now I want to push back some of the pink that I've just added, so I'm over blending it by saturating the area with the next lightest color. That's going to give us kind of a diffused blend. And I'm adding some of my darkest shadows to her hair. That's going to add contrast and help give it depth. Now I'm adding just a little bit of pink to her eye. For this sort of style where you can get a lot of blending, I think it's fun to add contrasting colors to the eyes. It just makes them a little bit more interesting. I'm also kind of inking my piece a little bit with the markers, adding additional color. And for this style, I like working with a limited palette. It's just a little bit easier for me, especially because colors can kind of get away from you and blend out a bit. So generally what I'll do is I'll work with 2 contrasting color families and just kind of work within those color families. There's my nose. As I said, my eyesight's pretty terrible, so I like to get on top of my drawings, and sometimes when I'm recording, that doesn't facilitate that. And now I'm using suntan, I think it might be light suntan, just to add more contrast to her skin. I'm not adding shadows the way I would normally add shadows, where I would use a blue violet. I'm just sticking with a skin tone color to add shadows. And then I'm blending or over blending that out with the E29. Now here I kind of made a bit of a mistake. I use a B000, which is usually what I use to shade white things, and it's what I used in her eyes. I used it to add just a little bit of shadow on her, like the pinky white socks. I probably should have gone for a blue violet, something that's a little bit warmer. And then I decided I wanted to add something cooler to the shadow side of her head, so I'm using a red violet to add some shadows and to blend out that blue a little bit. This makes it darker, but it also makes it a little bit cooler, which is going to make it seem like it's receding into the distance. Now I'm using, well, for a moment I used one of those Artist Loft markers just to add a little bit of cool color as well. Since I've got most of her dress finished, I'm just trying to add a little bit more depth and contrast to her eyes. As I continue to work on this piece through various stages, I'm going to keep picking up my markers and adding details here and there. You can see at the bottom of the page where I sort of swatched my colors to see what would work. I'm going to cut her out and mount her on something else, so I'm not really concerned about that. And I started using a white Signo gel pen to start adding in some white highlights. On her eyes, I don't think you guys can see it, but I did a little cherry blossom or flower shaped highlight. So now I'm using the Sakura of America PN. So it's like their plastic nib brush pens, or not brush pens, but they're fine liners. And these are nice because I'm heavy-handed and they're just less prone to tearing up the paper. I don't know, I like sketching with them. And I'm using pink. And I'm going to be using pink for the majority of this piece. Now what's nice about the Sakura of America liners is that they are alcohol marker proof and waterproof. So if I want to go on top of this and add more color, it's not going to smear. And if I want to use watercolor to do that, it's not going to smear as well. This is a sketchbook, so it's not really designed to take water very well. It's not designed to take alcohol marker either. I just happen to like how it takes alcohol marker. If you're doing a colored line art, these can be really fun because usually when you line with black, it has a tendency to deaden the piece. You're adding a lot of a neutral, saturated color, and it's like too consistent. So it's always the same color if you just ink with black. But if you're inking with sort of colored lines, then you're not deadening it as much. You're just adding a little bit of extra contrast. You guys have seen me ink with the Muji gel pens in the past. I also really like inking with those. They're just a little bit prone to clogging, and you can only get so many layers with the Muji gel pens. I was kind of hoping with the Sakura PN pens that I could get more layers of ink on my illustration. And I'm just adding a little bit of ocean green, I believe, Copic ocean green to her eyes, just to get some more contrast and depth. And now I'm inking on top of the Copic marker using my pink PN marker. And I really like that I did her eyelashes with the Copic first, because it kind of creates a base layer. I'm using a Marvy Le Pen to ink her eyes because I don't have a green Sakura PN pen. I don't like the Marvy liners. Those are water-based. They're going to be water soluble. It's just, it puts down kind of a fuzzy line. It doesn't really put down a sharp line like I would like. And with the pink PN pen, I am filling in some areas just a little bit. I'm not using a lot of cross hatching necessarily. I'm just trying to build up some extra contrast and depth. And again, I use the Marvy pen to ink the leaves, and that's just because the leaves are a little bit fuzzy. So with this style of lining or this style of art, you don't have to ink every single thing. You don't have to do a solid outline. You can use kind of lost and found lines to imply light, or to imply how heavy an object is, or how large or how important an object is. Usually the thicker your line art, it either implies that there's a very strong light source on it casting a very heavy shadow, or that it's a very heavy object, like you would use a heavier line art on a rock than you would on a feather, or that it is an important object like you would use if you had a hand crossing over a chest or a shirt. And the PN pen doesn't have any flexibility. It's fairly easy to control, but you're not going to naturally get multiple line weights out of it. You're going to need to go back over your lines and kind of thicken them up where you want a stronger line weight. Now, one of the reasons I like lining with this style is this paper has a tendency to get a little bit fuzzy, a little bit bleedy. You can kind of see it with her shoes. And adding a line art just kind of tightens everything up, and it makes it look a little bit cleaner. Even if you worked really sloppy, adding a line art can help tie everything together. So I'm using a little bit of white gouache just to reintroduce some white back into her hair, since cherry blossoms are very light pink. I'm also using it just to add some white highlights here and there. This is a good way to reintroduce some contrast if everything's gotten kind of over blended and too much the same color. I'm also using it to kind of try and imply that her stockings are indeed stockings. So next, I wanted to add some glimmer and a little bit of glamour. So I'm using various fine tech palettes to kind of introduce some sparkle to this piece. So I'm using a very, very light pink iridescent, and I'm adding that onto her cheeks, onto her lips, onto her stockings, onto her dress. So this way she kind of sparkles in the sunlight. I really like doing this with my cuter, more anime style pieces, and I really like doing this with pieces that are going to be where I'm selling the physical piece. Now, like I said earlier, this is not a watercolor paper. This is just sketchbook paper. So I'm trying to work really light and not add too much water and not do too much blending, because this paper really cannot take too much work. Now I'm using a very light green iridescence to add some iridescent notes to the leaves and to her eyes and to, yep, leaves and eyes. And this dried flat. So I know it looks dark and kind of chunky on the camera. It dried flat. I'm also adding some white pearl to her hair. Some of the Finetec colors are translucent, some of them are a little bit more opaque, and I like kind of playing with the two. I'm adding white opaque pearl accents now to her little socks. And I'm using a very light rose gold to add sort of golden freckles to her cheeks. It's only viewable in certain lights. It's not always present. And I'm also going to use that to add dots to her stockings to kind of help imply that these are stockings. All right, so that is the piece with Finetec added. I scanned it. Next, I'm going to cut it out. I don't try to do a kiss cut, which is when you get a perfect cut. I try just to get kind of a halo cut. And I also wanted to kind of re-ink her hands, make them a little bit darker. And now I'm going to go around and do a better job cutting the piece out. If you have a Cricut, you could scan it and set your parameters on your Cricut and have your Cricut do the cutting for you. But for a single piece, I'd rather just do it by hand. And leaving that slight halo is a reminder that, I don't know, it's like the hand of the artist kind of thing. And I want to cut out that area between her arm and her leg, so I'm using an X-Acto blade. I don't use an X-Acto blade for the whole thing, just because I find them kind of hard to manage. I don't really understand how artists can use X-Acto blades to cut like an entire piece out. Scissors are much easier to manipulate. So this is a sign board. I picked it up at Daiso, and it's kind of like, it's like a, well, Bowie has opinions on what it is, but he wouldn't know. It's kind of like a thick piece of illustration board that I want to mount her to. So I'm using a repositionable adhesive, and I'm using some of the Chiyogami paper from my paper stash to create a simple background for her. I don't want the background to be too distracting, but I love working with sort of real media pieces. Here's a piece of lace paper that didn't really make it into the final cut. And here is some of the beautiful Sakura washi tape from my April Zen Pop box. I have the unboxing available for you guys to watch if you're interested. This is another piece of Sakura washi from the same box. And I'm going to use my golden Finetec just to add some gold accents So I'm just flicking it onto the paper using a stiff synthetic brush. So I went primarily with green papers as kind of a contrast for our little cherry blossom girl. Of course, there's also some cherry blossom paper on there. I guess just to hammer the idea home. I have a pretty large collection of Chiagami papers, and I really like using them for these kinds of commissions, these kind of pieces. So next, I'm going to use these Yuzen paper, like sakura stickers. Part of it is just to help adhere her further to the paper, but it's also to add some texture, some color. I also used these washi paper, kind of traditional pattern dots that I have. They're like envelope seals, but I think they're really cute. I did have some sakura stickers, and I have no idea where those went off to. Otherwise, I would use them. So this is my finished piece. It will be available for sale at the Cherry Blossom Festival here in Nashville. I hope you guys enjoyed this video.